So welcome this evening to understanding standard deviation, IQs, and that bell curve model of how that interacts with an individual with intellectual and developmental disability. CG, do you want to introduce yourself and start your presentation?
I'm CG LaScala. I'm an advocate with the ARC of Arapahoe Douglas, and I am delighted to share with you this information. It is it's simple, but it's not, okay? So just bear with me, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding of it at the end of my little talk here. The bell curve is used to help understand the evaluation results of testing that we use to determine eligibility for students who are seeking special education support to be on an IEP. And it's important that we understand that there are, these are really statistics of measurement of the evaluation of the results. So the visual curve is simply a visual component that demonstrates where a student performs on a scale in the various areas that are used to determine a student eligibility for special education services. And it is a visual depiction of the natural phenomenon of percentages of performances on unbiased evaluations. For our purposes of determining disability eligibility for special education, the areas that are most commonly evaluated are education, and I think most of you probably realize that. So it's called academic. And an example of a test that would be used to evaluate that would be the Wyatt, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Scale. The Woodcock-Johnson is another test that is used very commonly. Communication, so speech and language. Speech being how we can clearly communicate. It's our articulation and our voice and our fluency, how smoothly we can speak. And then language, which is the understanding of words. Physical motor, and that includes fine and gross motor skills. Social emotional skills, that includes information related to children who may have behavior differences, may have attention differences, may have activity levels, sensory levels that are a challenge to serve in the classroom, are executive functioning skills, organization, sequencing, initiating tasks, following through on tasks, finishing tasks, turning in whatever the work is. Those kinds of things are executive functioning. And then lastly is the intellectual component. And so that's just where the person falls cognitively. So a test would be the individual scale for children, which is the Wechsler scale. And another one is the Stanford-Binet. There are the Leiter is a nonverbal one, the Kaufman. There are several tests in that area as well. So some students are also evaluated in their daily living skills. And that's just how well they can take care of themselves, or they can perform domestic skills, how well they can be independent in doing some things or all things or no things. So the results of these tests along with record reviews, going back and looking at the child over a historical period of time, teacher observations, so what the teacher sees in the classroom right now, any private assessments that the parents may share can be reviewed as well and considered, and then parent input. So together, all of these things are used to look at the eligibility of the student and apply the federal criteria to all the things that the school has learned to help make a determination if the kiddo is eligible and meets the federal criteria that's established under the federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Then, just before I tell you about the different pieces that we're going to talk about, I want you to understand that this chart encompasses, theoretically at least, all populations of the world, children who are seeking special education services. And so whenever they are evaluated, if you take a classroom of 30 children, or you take a classroom of 150 students, you're going to have outcomes that fall within this bell curve. So about 67.x% are going to fall in the average range of operation, of function, okay? So depending on what's being evaluated and what you're applying it to, again, looking at the academic, looking at the social emotional, looking at the physical motor, looking at all the areas that are evaluated when a school district is making a or hoping to make a determination of eligibility. All those areas that I talked about: communication, intelligence, academic, physical motor, social emotional. Where does it fall? Where do the students' test results fall on this chart? So a majority is going to fall in this range of average, which you can see there on the screen. Then there will be about 13.x% that falls in the range of below average or above average. You can see that on the chart. And again, moving away from the center of the chart, you have 3.x% that will be in the lower extreme range or in the upper extreme range. And then finally, in that fourth area there on either side of the middle of the chart will be less than 1%, much less than 1%. It's more like 0.2%. But I have X there because it's all supposed to add up to 100%, all right? Now, keep in mind that most tests can fall in one of these ranges. The middle range, the very middle, is 100. So that line that's at the top of the bell that goes straight down from the top, that line is called the mean, and it is 100, okay? That 100 only would equate, if you need a grade to make it equal so that you can kind of understand it better, is that 100 is equated to a C, not an A. So don't think of it as an A, and don't think of any of these scores as letter grades. Just look at it as average. So the majority of the population, you guys included in the majority of the population, may fall in that average range. But Because average can only hold so many people, when they test out on these evaluations, we look at standard deviations, okay? We look at standard scores, and the standard scores are those numbers that move either on the negative side, which is to the, actually I'm looking at it and it's to the left, or the positive side, which is to the right. And every 15 points is called a standard deviation. So you can see there are 4 standard deviations in this bell curve, all right? Because we're using it simply for evaluation purposes to help us make a determination of special education eligibility. If we were looking at something else, shoe sizes, hair color, eye color, height, weight, if we were looking at other things, we might have more standard deviations using different numbers. But for our purposes, we use a standard deviation of 15 points, and they move in increments away from the mean. So every 15 points, either side of the mean is 1 standard deviation. So if you look at the numbers along the bottom there, and you see at the very bottom of this chart, you can see the standard deviation numbers. And so you can see that we go out to a 4. Average falls within 1 standard deviation to the left and 1 standard deviation to the right. And that range then becomes a standard score. A standard score for average is between 85 and 115. And those are numbers that the school district looks at when determining where a student is functioning academically, communication-wise, physical motor-wise, emotionally, and so forth. All of those areas are going to be based on these numbers. So as you can see, above average is 116 to 130. The highest level, or one of the higher levels of it, extreme in, above average, is 130 or greater. And then 145 is that little tiny percentage over there in the 4th standard deviation. And looking in the other direction, 70 to 84 is below average. 55 to 69 is the lower extreme. And then at the very 4th standard deviation, it's just very low. So very high, very low. Now, as we look at the standard scores, they use the mean, and that's very important. So if your kiddo has an intellectual disability, it's most likely that your child will have an IQ over here in the 70s. It is most likely that your child will have communication skills somewhere in the 70s or less. It is sometimes likely that their motor skills will also fall in that lower range, that they may be awkward, if you would. That's the simplest way I can think of it. On the other hand, in these above average ranges, it's important to know that whenever people go outside the 85 to 115, it is often that others will pick up on their differences. And it's really important to know that all of us are so different from one another that that we have to value those differences. And in looking at these, you know, when people age, the people in the, let's say, the 3rd standard deviation and the 4th standard deviation, on either side of that 100 often look very much the same. And so when you think about it, when somebody, I don't know, is in their late 70s, their 80s, or older, many times they appear as if they have cognitive differences. And that's just an element of the way that people age. Sometimes it's Parkinson's, sometimes it's Alzheimer's, or sometimes it's an intellectual disability. As we are, you know, those are people that need support no matter where they fall on the bell curve. And usually it's those folks that are at least in the 4th standard deviation, and very often some individuals that are in the 3rd standard deviation. It really depends on how people learn to use their abilities, and ability can compensate for a lot, you know, it can really compensate for a lot. So then again, there's percentile rankings, which help us see where the individual is performing compared to other students, usually the same age. Okay, so a percentile is not a percentage of correct answers, but rather a student that scores in the 50th percentile is going to score at or better than individuals, than 50% of the individuals who are his peers or her peers. Of 100 peers standing in line, the student performing at the 50th percentile would be the 50th student in line. I also wanted to tell you the meaning of unbiased testing, because that's very important when we give tests. Unbiased testing are those tests that don't discriminate against the individual in whatever category they're being evaluated. And I'm going to give you the simplest example I can come up with. A non-English speaking person should be assessed in his or her native language. That way, the test is not biased against the person's language abilities. Or a student that's nonverbal would be tested non-verbally, and so forth. So just keep in mind that all of the tests that we're talking about should be unbiased for the child. And so, you know, every area can be evaluated with a non-biased test, just so you know those are available. And if your child is not verbal, then you can say, I want him or her tested non-verbally. I want an unbiased test administered. So just be aware that those are things that you need to ask for when it's time for your kiddo to be assessed. And then the last area are the Stanine scores, and I put these on here, or I have these on here because it's important to know that there's so many tests out there, and your child can be evaluated in by any of these tests, and some of them use Stanine scores. And Stanines, so if you run along the bottom right, see the first line there where it says Stanine, It shows you the mean for stay 9 is 5. The mean for the rest of the testing for standard scores is 100, okay? But the mean for stay 9 is 5, and the average range is 4 to 6. And so if you're below average, you're going to score in the third stay 9. If you're above, you're going to score in the 7th stay 9, and so forth. So the above a 6 is a strength. Below a 4 is considered a weak area. So those numbers, and again, using those percentages, if a student is evaluated, and the stay 9 is the resulting score, then you're still going to have around 67 point something percent falling in the average range, and then moving away using the same standard deviations with stay 9 numbers instead of standard scores. So that's your bell curve. And just so you know, there are many, many bell curves that measure many, many different things. So this is what's used in education, and it's specific to education. So I want you to understand that if somebody talks to you about a bell curve and they're talking about the number of dimples on a golf ball, it's going to be different, okay? It's a bell curve can be squished closer together so that the mean right there in the middle is much taller than ours is, or it can be flattened. In fact, and don't ask me about this because I don't know how to calculate it, but I have heard of it, and it's been applied to work that I've done in the past as a student myself, and that is grading on the curve. I'm sure you mostly have heard of getting a grade on the curve. Well, this is the curve, and the way that they come up with the mean in doing that is they take all the tests and all the test results, and they add them together and they divide by the number of tests, and that becomes the mean, whatever it is. Now, how they decide what an A, B, or C is on your paper when they grade on the curve, I can't answer that part, but I do know how they come up with the mean for that bell curve. All right, I don't know how long I talked,